And our next speaker, I'm pleased to say, is Dr. Augustine Choco. Hi. Nice to meet you. So 15 minutes. I'll give you a 5-minute sign and a 2-minute sign. Okay?
Thank you very much. I'm really very excited to attend this meeting. It's my first time. I would like to thank the organizers for that opportunity. My presentation is just sharing some lessons from an adaptive mat-arm, mat-stage class randomized trial that we conducted in Blantyre, Malawi, looking at the question of what are the strategies that can be used to increase HIV testing and linkage to follow-on services among male partners whose women were pregnant and coming to the antenatal clinic for the first time. So the research question is, what are the most promising interventions, candidate interventions for increasing the uptake of testing and linkage for male partners, like I said earlier on. And to look at that particular question, we designed a mat-arm, mat-stage class randomized trial. It was designed to be a small study with a unit of randomization of the antenatal care day. So it's the day when women present is the cluster. So I think it's important that we understand that one first. So it's not the clinic. And we also factored in an interim analysis at the end of the first stage, as illustrated on the diagram. So really, we're starting with 6 trial arms, then conduct an interim analysis at the end of the first stage, randomize a completely independent set of days, so clusters, to the remaining arms, and then analyze as a complete study at the end of stage 2. So the primary outcome is the proportion of male partners who had a test, an HIV test, and came back to the clinic for either to start ART or to receive prevention services within 28 days of randomizing the woman. So the trial was completed in June 2017, and the first stage had 36 clusters, 6 in each trial arm, as shown on the first, is that your right-hand side or left-hand side of the figure here? We had 1,404 women who presented to the antenatal clinic, and 23% were not eligible, mostly because their partner said was not going to be present within the 28-day period, or they were already on ART, so they were not eligible. Some women discontinued soon after learning their trial arm, so I'm going to explain how the trial process took place. And then we had 36 clusters. In the end, we didn't have any clusters that were removed. So there was 0 loss to follow-up in terms of number of clusters, although the actual follow-up for individual women was about 74% for the first stage. We saw much higher participation in the second stage, where, of course, at the end of the first stage, we had dropped 1 trial arm, which is the lottery arm. I'm going to also explain about that very soon. So the standard of care was a woman got a letter that was addressed to the male partner inviting him to have a test at the clinic that we had set up as part of the trial. Or additionally, in the 5 intervention arms that started in the first stage, women got 2 self-test, oral self-test kits with the instructions for her to take home to train the male partner on how to self-test. And then in two other trial arms, the men, once they came to the clinic, they were eligible to get a $3 financial incentive in one of the arms or a $10 financial incentive in the other to cover for out-of-pocket costs or lost time, so opportunity cost in the $10 arm. And the other arm was done as a lottery, so the men had a 10% chance of winning $3 times the number of men that had come on that particular day. And the final arm had reminders, so done as a phone call to the male partner to remind him to self-test and to come to the clinic. So all the analysis was done as an intention to treat analysis using the number of women who were eligible as the denominator throughout. And the primary outcome, I have to remind you, is looking at actual men who came to the clinic. So this is not women reporting, but actual men who came to the clinic. And 29%, roughly 29% of men came back when we combine across the two stages, most of whom were HIV negative, and some said they were already circumcised, the majority of whom were already circumcised, but some were not circumcised and were linked to circumcision, which was conducted by a separate service provider. And 7% were confirmed to be HIV positive and were referred for ART by our study counselors. We didn't see any serious adverse events. There were 3 adverse events in which case women were so interested for the man to self-test, so there were some sort of force issues. And in 2 cases, the men left the woman for 2 to 3 days and then came back and reconciled. In one case, the woman left after suffering some sort of verbal abuse, and then she came back again within 2 to 3 days. So these are the data for the primary outcome, and I'll run through this quickly because the idea is to focus on the ethical issues that arose through the trial. But what you really see is the middle bit. You see the 2 fixed financial incentive arms, which is the $3 and $10 financial incentives, were way significantly better than the standard of care, which is shown here. So what you see, the blue dots are the proportion in each day, so the cluster. So that's what is represented there. And the red horizontal line represents the mean across those proportions. And you can see that the standard of care and the lottery were not that different. So therefore, we dropped the lottery. And also, just providing self-test kits only without adding anything else was also not significantly different from the standard of care. But the 2 fixed financial incentive arms, as well as the reminder just about, were the ones that significantly improved the primary outcome. So there are 4 ethical issues that we've picked, and I'll try to discuss this briefly. The first one relates to the issue of how do we justify the use of an adaptive class randomized trial? Well, the nature of the interventions themselves meant that there was no way we could do it as an individual randomized trial, because you can imagine in the same clinic, we couldn't have one woman walking out with test kits, self-test kits, and another not having test kits. And obviously, they are going to have a discussion, and so that can bring problems. And we might be interested in group-level effects, so to see, whether effects, differ when we apply them at group level as opposed to individual level. And for the adaptive nature of the design, we are interested in the efficiency. So adaptive designs are thought of as more efficient as opposed to parallel designs in terms of the number of study participants that you may require. So for example, in this particular study, overall across the 2 stages, we had 2,350 women. And I'm sure in a parallel design, we could have had many more women. And in terms of the time that it takes to actually, conduct the study, this study overall took 8 months. That's across the entire 2 stages. You can imagine that if we're doing parallel studies, we would have had 5 different class randomized trials, and they would have probably taken 5 or more years to complete. But this took 8 months. So that was really more efficient in terms of the design. And of course, then it implies that the cost of doing the study is also reduced. I think I have touched on the issue of, there's potential contamination if we randomize at the individual level. But the choice of a day as the cluster can also be argued, that you could have some potential contamination there. But, the preferable choice of a unit would probably be a clinic as a whole. But we chose the day. The second issue is the way that we did the informed consent. So the diagram here summarizes the process through which we took our participants, and I've highlighted the ones that we think potentially are stages where ethical issues might arise. The first one is that we had a group session with women, telling them in general what the study was about, and then they received their routine antenatal care. Then we saw them one-on-one, where we did now written informed consent or with a thumbprint witnessed consent. Again, we didn't talk to the men who we really wanted to recruit in this study, but we got them via their women. So therefore, we could not obtain written consent from the men, so we asked for a waiver of consent. And so you have a woman who has to return home to tell her husband or partner that you have been enrolled in a study. That is a problem, because we haven't sought any consent from him per se. So that is a potential problem. The third issue, being a two-stage design, is that at interim analysis, we were able to look at the data. And that's the data at interim analysis. And you can see the pattern is quite similar to what we saw at the end of the study. And so you see this standard of care at the design stage, we assumed that it was going to be 25%, it was going to have 25% of people achieving the primary outcome. And here we are at the interim analysis, it shows 13%, efficacy. So we know this, but we have to continue because it's an adaptive trial and has a two-stage design. So how do you continue with a standard of care which is abysmal? And at the same time, how do you continue knowing that these interventions, you can see these effect sizes are quite large. How do you continue knowing that these are far better than the standard of care? So is there equipoise in terms of, at this particular stage? But since we've gone in saying this is a two-stage design with a data and safety monitoring board, making decisions which arms to drop, then we have had to continue with the same design. Then we've got post-trial access, particularly because of financial incentives. Policymakers do not like financial incentives because I think they are challenging to implement, particularly in settings where there's high corruption and logistically difficult to implement. But how do you play blind knowing that these are the interventions that will work? So this is a hard-to-reach group of men who do not test at all. And then we know that, and you can see these are the narratives coming from our qualitative study, showing very clearly that introducing an incentive which mitigates out-of-pocket costs or opportunity cost is going to work. And we've seen in the trial that that really works, actually. But there's reluctance among policymakers to actually implement these type of interventions. So there's a bit of a dilemma as to what's the point in having interventions or trials that show that these interventions work, but they cannot be taken to scale. So to summarize, what we've shown here is arguably a novel design, and I know that adaptive designs have been used, particularly in drug trials and individual randomized trials, but ours is probably the first class randomized trial with an adaptive design factored in, and we've shown that very well. We've discussed the potential problems to do with informed consent, with the nature of the cluster design, and the potential lack of equipoise after the interim analysis, and the issues to do with post-trial access. I would like to end by acknowledging everyone who has been on the team, as well as Charles had very good input, and I'm really thrilled to be here, and just to thank you very much for listening to our presentation.
Thank you very much. We'll have a couple of questions for clarification. We have time for a question or two of clarification for Dr. Choco first. Yes, in the back.
Hello, my name is Munya Dimairo. I'm a trial statistician from the University of Sheffield. I think it's one of the challenges that we face when you are kind of like designing some of these trials is about the interim decision-making criteria to drop treatment arms. So based on your experiences, was it easy to come up with a criteria to inform how to drop a treatment arm at interim analysis? Secondly, I think it's more to do with who had access to interim data. Was it only the DMARC, or you had access to it as well? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was not easy to come up with the criteria for dropping the arms. But so we had three criteria that we set in the first place. The first was that any intervention which had a p-value of greater than 0.2 should be considered for dropping by the Data Safety and Monitoring Board. The second was that if an arm had concerns to do with safety, so if we had more frequent women reporting of intimate partner violence, then that arm should be considered to be dropped. And the third was about cost effectiveness of the arm per male partners that achieve the primary outcome. We considered only the first two at the interim analysis. And the Data Safety Monitoring Board were the members who had access to the data as well as the investigators. So, both members had access to the data.
Another question of clarification before we move into our discussion. Here up front.
I am Blessing from Zimbabwe. I just wanted to get a clarification. So you've really highlighted, a number of very interesting ethical issues. So are these your sort of like the issues that you, as the researchers of this project, reflected on before submitting to an ethics committee, or are these actually feedback that you got from an ethics committee? In other words, what do you think were some of the issues that were raised by ethics committees in practice? I mean, those issues that you were raising, were they the feedback that you got from the ethics committee, or those are the reflections from the researchers before submitting that proposal to the ethics committee? Thank you.
So, the only issue that we had already picked up on before submitting was the fact that we wanted to recruit men via women. So we needed to have a waiver. That was the only issue. The other issues we are reflecting on, after the conduct of the trial, in terms of future studies, need to take into account or look critically at some of these issues. So for example, because the cluster was the day, it meant that if you have 1,000 women on that day, you have got to recruit all of them. So, how do you practice good informed consent practice in that particular sense? You have lots of people to screen and recruit because it's the day which is the cluster. So these are things that we experienced during the trial, and we are trying to share with the wider audience.